a psychologist would pick or offering to pay for a nose job. The theory being that I would look less Jewish and boys would find me more attractive, so I'd be happy to go straight. I think about Judy L., whose mother refused to continue paying for her college tuition until she did have a nose job. Judy submitted to surgery. It didn't make her straight. I think about Gloria W. and other friends who were thrown into mental hospitals for the crime of being a lesbian and given electroshock therapy. It didn't make them straight either. I think about the women I knew whose children were taken away, about the teenagers who were thrown out of their homes with no way to earn a living except prostitution. I'd actually been in therapy before I came out to my mother, and the therapist said I should be bisexual because I was cutting half the world out of my dating pool. Of course, she was straight and married. She didn't try to be bisexual to increase her dating pool, and didn't tell her straight patients to do so either. But in those days, this condescension was considered liberal. You all heard that gay sex was against the law back then, that the only places for people like us to gather were mafia-run bars where we could pay premium rates for watered-down drinks and be subject at any time to police raids, that we could suffer public humiliation, that the cops might call our bosses or landlords or parents and have us fired or thrown out of our homes. We were at the mercy of the self-righteous sadists of psychiatry, the legislatures, law enforcement, the clergy, and our own families. So by the time of Stonewall, I and many other gay people were sitting on a smoldering pile of rage. We'd seen plenty of examples in other civil rights contexts of how to channel that rage. I'd been inspired by the Freedom Rides, but been too young to go. In 1963, I read The Feminine Mystique and signed up with the National Organization for Women. In 1964, I got on a bus to Washington for the first of many anti-war marches. In 1967, at age 23, I joined the Daughters of Believers. They saw that I was a good talker, and unlike the mostly closeted members, was willing to represent the organization in public, so they made me public speaker. First assignment was addressing the kids in an abnormal psych class. Then came a radio show, and then daytime TV. And then, that hot Saturday night in 1969, came the Stonewall riot. I've told this story many times, how I was passing the Stonewall in then, and thought it was yet another anti-war demonstration. I had no idea the people throwing rocks at the cops were gay, until Monday morning when I read it in the paper. I immediately phoned the head of the Daughters of Believers. We need to have a protest march, I said. She told me to call the head of the gay men's organization, the Manishing, and make a proposal. If they agree, she said, we'll sponsor it jointly. A few days later, Manishing had a big meeting at Town Hall to discuss the events. I made my proposal, and the members voted to support it. After the meeting, some of us formed an organizing committee. On July 27th, exactly 1 month after the riots, a couple hundred of us marched around Greenwich Village and then rallied at Christopher Park, right across from the Stonewall. And that was actually the first gay protest march after the riots. That little march was the predecessor of what has since morphed into gay pride parades. Back then, however, it was the first time most of the participants had dared to show themselves as gay in public, out in the sunshine. And our minuscule organizing committee had already named itself the Gay Liberation Front. What was different about the Gay Liberation Front? The other groups, like BOB and Manishing, were single-issue organizations. They were focusing on getting America to accept gays into the mainstream, pleading that we were just like anyone else, with a slight variation, like being left-handed, they used to say. That we just wanted mainstream jobs, the house in the suburbs, the white picket fence, and the barbecue grill in the backyard. And those members who happened to be leftists in those gay organizations were expected to keep quiet about their politics, because we wouldn't want the straight world to think we were a bunch of communists. Meanwhile, gay members of socialist or feminist organizations were expected to keep their sexual orientation hidden, because they wouldn't want the world to think the Socialist Party was just a bunch of queers, or that those feminists were just a bunch of man-hating dykes. But we GLFers had no interest in being accepted into the mainstream. We hated the war that ended up murdering about 2.5 million Indo-Chinese, people who had never done anything to harm our country, and killing or wounding around 200,000 U.S. service members. We hated the prevailing racism here at home. We hated the patriarchal system. Instead of pleading for acceptance, we raged against the vast cruelty of our society and demanded what we still demand: justice for all. We marched against the war carrying our GLF banners. We formed alliances with the Black Panthers, with the Young Lords, a Puerto Rican liberation organization, and with feminist groups and socialist groups. We showed up at their conferences, and even those who were reluctant to accept us came around. And because we made those alliances, we helped to create a vast change in American culture, to the point that we gained the mainstream acceptance that we hadn't even been looking for. We got the right to gay marriage and to serve in the military. Now gay rights are under attack again, along with women's reproductive rights. Blacks are still being imprisoned in disproportionate numbers. Cops beat and murder them with impunity. The United States continues to invade countries that have done us no harm and to kill millions of civilians. And I'm sure that I don't have to remind you of the astronomical increase in economic inequality and the continuing destruction of the planet by global warming. We were a small, raggle-taggle bunch of young people. We had no funding, no positions of influence within the system, no careers to lose, and that gave us courage. As has been said, change comes from the bottom, not the top. But there's a dance between the outsiders and the insiders, those who raise hell on the streets, and those who respond by taking our demands to court or running for office. And the fight for justice is far from over. Every one of us has a contribution to make. What risks will you take? What will you do for the sake of justice when this conflict is over?
Harry, can you follow that? I'm very, very pleased to follow that. I have loved Martha Shelley for 50 years, so I'm very pleased, I'm very honored. People often ask me if I was at Stonewall, and I'm one of the few people who will definitely say no. I was actually around the corner at an old bar called Julius's when some young men raced in to tell us that the girls were rioting at the Stonewall. It took me a while to understand what that meant. Police actions, demonstrations, sit-ins, and marches had become the order of the day due to the Vietnam War and the political unrest of the period. The next night I went out to Sheridan Square and saw what was going on. The broken glass, hundreds of people milling about, the very theatrical, glaring police riot lights, lots of what we call street queens, that is, young gay people who had a street life, something almost non-existent in America today. They were smiling. So was I. I was ebullient, glowing. Why? It's hard for most people to understand the horror and humiliation of being queer in New York then, of being the constant butt not only of jokes but of threats, of physical and emotional violence, of keeping so much of your life under wraps, hardly in a closet, but in a sewer, of feeling like a worthless outsider with basically no legal or ethical rights or recourse. I'd come to New York after growing up an impoverished Jewish kid in Savannah, Georgia, an extremely conservative city with a strong KKK chapter. I had come out to myself at 16 and to many of my friends a year later. I realized then that the best thing that could have happened to me in Savannah would have been, well, that I would not have been murdered. Later, after moving to New York in August of 1966, a month before my 19th birthday, I experienced a bar raid and also being harassed at work and fired several times for being gay. I also experienced the love and embrace of my own outsider gay community. We had a genuine closeness then, and I really miss that. When Stonewall exploded, all I can say is that we were all there. Anyone who believed in the moral rights of the oppressed was there. or who believes in the biblical injunction that the oppressed deserve justice was there. Stonewall has been compared to the Boston Tea Party, the John Brown Rebellion, and Rosa Parks' moment when one woman, and at Stonewall was also one woman, said, "I've had enough." And that is what we all need to feel again and again, that "I've had enough" moment. Just as the Jews say every Passover, we were all in Egypt and we've all been freed. Everyone in this room was at Stonewall. Everyone needs to act in that moment when we see through the strength of a shared being our own resistance in the face of oppression. And it is still there. It's not going away. What's going on in Washington, D.C., in Poland, in Chechnya, in Brazil, Uganda, and Kenya, and all over the Middle East, and in Israel tells us this, and we need to know and to change this. In November of 1969, shortly after my 22nd birthday, I joined the Gay Liberation Front. I stayed with GLF for 3 years, one of the most formative and educating experiences of my life. The Gay Liberation Front was a radical organization. We believed in fundamental economic and governmental changes in America and the world. But most important, we learned to look at the world through what we called a radical lens. Radical meaning going to the root of the problem, the real issue, as people say now. We saw that what oppressed gay men was what also oppressed women, especially lesbians, the chokehold that Western industrial patriarchy had put on us. We saw capitalism as one of the engines of patriarchy, but also saw that patriarchy and sexism were alive and functioning in socialist countries and in third world countries, where even governmental changes had not enacted genuine shifts in ingrained attitudes. Later, activists used the same radical lens to look at health, sex, AIDS, family, marriage, and other aspects of human life that affect us. One of the myths about GLF was that we were too young and besotted by the romance of leftist ideology to see the problems of the left. Not true. We've seen these same sexist motions in all the social movements of the times, including what was known then as the gay movement. And we realized that we needed a lot of effort to change it. Martha and I worked together on the GLF paper Come Out, and together with our sisters and brothers, we fought for social justice and for a change in consciousness, from passive, cynical, and destructive to active, moral, and constructive. GLF knew that only a change in consciousness could change the world. You had to be conscious, alert, and alive to the conditions of the world, as well as to its deeper and possible justice and goodness. Two concepts that are too often smothered in hypocrisy and what John Kenneth Galbraith called the popular wisdom, in other words, the accepted ignorance that passes for common sense. So we would not accept the usual, nothing is going to change, go with the flow, things are the way they are, get used to it. No, we were not going to get used to it. We were going to change the flow, no matter how much effort it took to do so. What Stonewall did and what we did after was to give queer people permission to release the innate and, in the most profound sense, decent parts of themselves. This was a struggle, but we were not alone in it, because so many of us were fighting against real self-destruction, desperate for some act of liberating self-creation that only together we could give each other. We had our forefathers and foremothers working in the shadows, some of them sentenced to obscurity because they could not be recognized by society for many decades to come. What we learned in the Gay Liberation Front and many of the organizations that we enabled to come after us is that along with liberation comes self-invention, but this does not come without responsibilities. We have a responsibility to each other, and part of that responsibility is to create a change that will allow us the safety to be ourselves. And as we learned later when we marched and picketed for gay rights to be enacted in New York, many years before it happened, legality should follow this. For years, our oppressors have said that we were not worth the law, or that any change in the laws in our favor would mean the end of civilization or morality or any of the usual lies used to destroy us. The old school orthodox and fundamentalist religious groups have said that even approaching us honestly is too sensitive for open discussion. In other words, they want to keep us a dirty secret that can only come out with the kind of scandals recently pummeling some religious closets. What this has shown us is that the closet is an evil, festering place, and only tearing the doors out from their hinges will change that. What Stonewall, the Gay Liberation Front, and other LGBT groups revealed is that there are no dirty secrets, only dirty minds. And what we've done is clean away centuries of the lies and hypocrisy of the way. This has altered life in America and the world. LGBT liberation has become one of the world's most universal movements. But we've also seen the reaction of fear and ignorance to it. The fear is always the same. The patriarchy and its rigidity holds the morals of the world together, and queer people threaten this rigidity. The rigidity is for some people comfortable. They find a refuge from their own problems in it. It's like a shell guarding some alarmed, scared creature within. They demand a respect for the shell, respect for their own homophobia, their own resorting to violence and keeping queer people, women, and other oppressed minorities in their place. We understood this in GLF. We also understood that it takes work to grant people the security to leave their shells. Sometimes it is overt political work, and other times it is simply the everyday work of investigating crimes against victims of sexual and gender violence, as well as changing the laws that allow the perpetrators of this violence to go not only unpunished, but even lauded in local or popular media. The question then is, what did Stonewall do? The answer, everything and nothing. It recognized those in need of validity, but on its own it did not change the laws of American society that said that, quote, normal, quote, family, heterosexual, social, and sexual mores comprised both the American state as well as a state religion. Most thinking people realize that this was just a front, another shell. The real question is not what was the rebellion of Stonewall and what did it accomplish, but what can we do to foster its spirit and keep its "I've had enough" moment going. The responsibility to see and change human mores to include the excluded has to go on. We were all there at Stonewall, believe me, and I feel very much that the work of that pivotal moment is finally just begun. Thank you.
Okay, so I hope you're taking notes of your thoughts and questions, because we will have time for that, because we could probably do 2 or 3 hours or maybe a day with Jeff and Martha and Terry. But we do want to bring it into the context of some more contemporary issues as well. Phil's the perfect person to do that, to talk about how things that Perry and Martha started can be seen today and some of the struggles that will continue. So Phil, you want to give us your thoughts?
Thank you, Jim. I want to thank the organizers. About that. Okay, can you hear me now? And I want to thank the organizers for putting this panel together, particularly Helen and my good friend Bill Weinberger. You know, I just retired from an organization where I was the oldest person on staff by 20 years. So it's nice to be on a panel where there are people who actually know what a telephone booth is. Or when you ask, where were you when Kennedy died, knows which Kennedy you were talking about. So having said that, you know, I must confess I was not at Stonewall on June of 1969. I have no firsthand experience to offer about what happened that night or the lived experiences of the folks who generated that action that night. I am honored, of course, to be in the presence of folks who have firsthand experience, and I'm so grateful that you are here today. What I hope to talk about this morning is really what were the lessons learned, or not, from Stonewall, and how did Stonewall help shape the rest of what was to become of the LGBTQI movement. I didn't come out until 1980. My first encounter with real gay and lesbian activism, and I mean real gay and lesbian activism because back then it was not about bisexuals, it was not about transgender, and no one would, if you called anyone queer, you would be in a fight. So it was clearly lesbian and gay activism back there. I was doing the second National March on Washington for lesbian and gay rights in 1987. I remember being on the mall and hearing this booming baritone voice from the stage across the mall. and I thought, I need to find out who this man is. And I followed the sound of this voice, as it went on and on and on. And then I got to it, and I looked up, and I saw him. And she was Pat Parker. Pat was a wonderful black lesbian activist. And she was reading her poem, Where Will You Be? Part of it read, citizens, good citizens all, parade into voting booths, and in self-righteous sanctity, X away our right to life. So I must make assessment, look to you and ask, where will you be when they come? It won't matter if you're homosexual, not a faggot, lesbian, not a dyke, gay, not queer. It won't matter if you own your own business, have a good job, or on SSI. It won't matter if you're black, Chicano, Native American, Asian, or white. It won't matter if you're from New York, or Los Angeles, Galveston, or Sioux Falls. It won't matter if you're butch or femme, not into roles, monogamous, non-monogamous. It won't matter if you're Catholic, Baptist, atheist, Jewish, or MCC. They will come. They will come to the cities and to the land, to your front rooms and your closets. And where will you be when they come? Pat's voice and her words echo in my ear every single day. It is one of the driving forces of my activism, my advocacy, and the policy work that I've done over the last 30 years. And it brings me back to what is the lasting legacy of the Stonewall riots. I mean, by all accounts, the folks that were in that bar that night represented the diversity of our movement, of our community. Many of them were people of color and, quite frankly, drag queens as well. Stonewall is credited with launching the modern LGBTQI movement, but I would submit Stonewall was also the place that started a battle within our movement that actually would go on all the way through the fight for marriage equality. In liberation politics, there's a concept called radical revolution versus moderate revolutions. The classic examples are the French Revolution versus the American Revolution. The French Revolution was a radical revolution. The American Revolution was a moderate revolution. Now, the French Revolution basically said, let's burn the system down. Down to the ground and start over. The American Revolution, on the other hand, said, well, let's not burn the system down. We just don't like who's the head of the system. So rather than have a king, we actually wanted all straight white men who own property to be kings. It was better than what was before. But basically, they were going to be kings. And so when you think about the moderate revolution and a radical revolution, it really is, as Perry talked about, what do you have to lose? Folks who are part of the radical revolution feel like there's nothing to lose and bring about radical change. And that's basically what many of the folks and what generated the riot on the night in Stonewall. Initially, I think the lesbian and gay movement was all about fighting the whole cloth of oppression, taking on all of these issues, kind of a radical movement. But pretty quickly, there was a sense about the price of the ticket. So in the price of the ticket, here's the debate. Are LGBTQI rights inalienable rights, or are they dependent on how well we assimilate? So the debate is this. Do I deserve equal rights no matter what? Or do my rights depend on my ability to mimic heteronormative behavior and conform to gender stereotypes? So as we look at kind of the movement, that battle and that tension began to exist from the very, very beginning. And the battle, quite frankly, of the moderate revolution took hold relatively early. And the radical revolutionaries became a minority voice in our movement. Now, and even you can see this in the original names of all of our organizations. Like all the organizations originally was the Gay This, and then eventually the Gay and Lesbian This. Now, and the truth of the matter is, it wasn't until recently that we actually found the strength in embracing the whole alphabet soup of who we are. Leaders, in fact, made proactive decisions to delete trans people from the initial INDA legislation. because they thought it'd be easier to pass legislation if trans people were not included. The second part of the debate on the notion of radicalism, I think is really the best examples are two of the three biggest issues that we've confronted over the last 30 years. One was gays in the military, the other was gays in the military, the other was marriage equality, and of course HIV/AIDS epidemic. On gays in the military, the debate was, should gays and lesbians have equal access to the military versus, instead of banning gays from the military, we should ban the military. That was the radical position on the issue. On marriage equality, there are those who believe strongly that we should have, our relationships have equal standing to heterosexual relationships. There are others, on the other hand, who felt that marriage, in fact, was a part of the patriarchy, and why should we be supporting the patriarchy in that regard? And so we see and we know kind of how those two outcomes happen. For us, it seems to me that what we have learned along the way, as some of the most important work we're doing today, really is happening in our trans community. And they're all about inclusivity, partially driven by what younger people are committed to, partially driven by, quite frankly, independent movements within our movement, and understanding the role and the experience that we have in other movements as well. What I think is important for the lessons we've learned and the lessons that we've yet to learn is to understand that either we address the entirety of the cloth of oppression, that we understand that oppression is of a whole cloth, that you can't cut out the part that offends you, wrap yourself in the garment, and call yourself just. You can't say, I just want to cut out the homophobia part, and the rest wrap yourself in that garment and call yourself just. You can't say, I just want to cut off the racism part and call yourself just. It's all of the whole cloth. The threads are woven throughout. We are better when we are part of all of the marginalized movements that are out there. Not as allies, but because we are part of those movements. We should support reproductive rights and equal pay for women's rights because those are important issues for us. We should support issues in the Black Lives Matter movement because those are important issues for us. We are victorious when we understand that we are not visitors to those movements. We wholly embrace and experience those movements. The voices of Stonewall, or at least the honor of the people who were actually most informed, that must inform our modern day movement. Our commitment must be to inclusion and diversity, and it must be unwavering. I would also submit to you that we actually owe a debt to all of those movements because our movement has had unprecedented advancement over the last 50 years. There's no other experience in human existence that has moved so quickly. One of the reasons why that happened is because where we came from, the tools that we brought to the movement. We brought the tools because we were in this peace movement and the anti-war movement. We brought the tools because we were in the Black Civil Rights movement. We brought the tools because we were in the farm workers movement. We brought the tools because we were in the women's movement. We brought those tools there. We learned those things from those movements. And not only is it the right thing to do to stay in those places, it is also the most important thing for us to do and the most effective things for us to do as well. I'll leave you with Pat Parker's beginning of the poem. I actually started in the middle of the poem, but she begins the poem in the following way. I do not believe, as some, that the vote is an end. I fear even more it is just the beginning. They will not come a mob rolling through the streets, but quickly and quietly move into our homes and remove the evil, the queerness, the faggotry, the perversion from their midst. They will not come clothed in brown and swastika or bearing chests heavy with gleaming crosses. The time and need for roosters are over. Where will you be when they come? Now, maybe the time for roosters are over, but it seems they're coming to vote for ballot boxes and they're still wearing the brown shirts and the swastikas.
Thanks. So this is a forum that's sponsored by an organization of lawyers. So it would be only right that we talk about the law, and nobody better to talk and place the things that Martha and Harry and Phil have been talking about in the context of legal thinking than I think Bill Eskridge introduced earlier, but who really is recognized, I think, in the legal community as a great thinker on these topics. Bill, I'm going to give you this clicker so that you can go through that.
All righty.
There you are.
So what I want to do, I'm going to take Perry's
Professors have to
invitation.
stand up.
I'm going to take Perry's invitation. Say I was at Stonewall in the Perry sense. I was literally in the South, but I was figuratively at Stonewall because it was very liberating for me. And Stonewall was really the explosion of the closet that was heard around the world and does have reverberations today. Though, in my opinion, as a law professor, they're very complicated. And I want to take just one example and sort of play it. Stonewall both generated the movement for marriage equality and torpedoed, and the marriage equality movement undermined and torpedoed to some extent the legacy of Stonewall. And that's going to be my thing. Now I want to start with sort of the lay of the land in terms of the debate within our communities. A very small number of people in the 1950s and the 1960s. The majority view was the view on the left, the natural law view. And that was the view of the New York government, the federal government, presidents, and that is that perverts or predatory heterosexuality is the only normatively acceptable way to go. And we were literally outlaws in every state except for Illinois. We were outlaws in New York, among other places. The liberal point of view, even within our own movement, was by and large the Mattachine, New York, and the Daughters of Bilitis point of view, which was kind of a be tolerant to us misfits point of view. That we're kind of like sad. Many of us would really rather be heterosexual. We're not trying to promote homosexuality. Just don't be mean to us. And that kind of precatory attitude was very common. There was a more liberal approach in Washington, D.C. Frank Kameny, the very famous gay activist, who actually in 1961 articulated gays deserve to be equally treated. That was really the beginning of that. He is credited as the originator of the gay is good locution. And his argument was that we should not be subject to any kind of discrimination. The discrimination based on homosexuality was no more justifiable than based upon race or anti-Semitism. And that was very important. That is Society of Washington, not here. Now, at the same time we were having those debates within our very small community, there were also these much larger debates that Martha and Harry are examples of that were going on around us. And many LGBT people, of course, were part of those debates. They're usually not as openly LGBT people. The big one was the sexual revolution. And the take-home point from the sexual revolution of the 1960s was a pervasive attack from lots of segments of American society, but mainly from young people, our generation, the baby boomers, on the idea of conjugal marriage as normative. When we were born, it was illegal. You were a criminal if you had sex or children outside of conjugal marriage. And obviously that is something that has continued to fall under some degree of criticism. Radical feminism, not just Betty Friedan, Kate Miller, on the eve of Stonewall, very important author, definitively arguing that patriarchy generates both women's subordination and sexual repression, and that gender and sexual liberation go hand in hand. And then the civil rights movement, and one of many exemplars I like to use for the civil rights movement is Pauli Murray, a Yale graduate who was African American and a leader in that movement. She was a leader in the women's rights movement, and she herself was very probably a transgender person who anticipated the queer rights movement as well. And what Pauli Murray advanced when she was at Yale was the hypothesis that the different forms of bigotry are interactive and indeed synergistic. And she's the originator of the critical race theory idea, the relationship of Jane Crow, a term she invented, and Jim Crow, the double whammy of misogyny and racism, vide Anita Hill and other examples more recently. Now, Stonewall, as you see, of course, was an explosion, and it was an intellectual explosion as well as a physical, social movement and political explosion. And it generated basically the discrediting of the old Mattachine, New York approach of bare tolerance. And it gave energy to the Mattachine, Washington approach of gay is good. But it also generated approaches to the left of Mattachine, Washington, represented by such organizations as the Gay Liberation Front and some of the other groups that I list there in New York City. And of course, there were many groups. Now, interestingly, gay liberation fronts formed all over the United States. There were not many of them as radical as the one in New York. But the gay liberation fronts outside of New York actually became the primary situs for marriage activism. And the first lawsuit and trial for gay marriage in American history was based upon the Louisville, Kentucky Gay Liberation Front, which was formed simultaneously with the lawsuit. And though this is very blurred, it gives you an early flyer publicizing the formation of the Gay Liberation Front in Louisville based upon the marriage issue, which the Gay Liberation Front sponsored. Now, I go to Minnesota now. That's this Fight Repression of Sexual Expression Free. It's kind of a version of the Gay Liberation Front that was in Minnesota, in Minneapolis. And within that Minneapolis group, there was an intense debate, very different from the pre-Stonewall debate. The tolerance people were the far right of that group. The ACLU liberals were kind of the moderates. And then many of the young people in that group had absorbed some of the radical energy of Stonewall. So their view was not just equal rights, sure they supported that, but the idea, as you pointed out, of transforming the status quo and dismantling the institutions of heterosexuality, which Kate Millett is to be believed would perhaps include marriage as well. They believed in what they called steam pipe politics. They believed in ZAPs, that's the New York terminology. There was actually an assault on the marriage bureaucracy at one point in 1971. And the idea that you should not accept marriage as it is, either transform marriage or even scrap it or supplement it. A number of the early marriage activists are depicted here. The first big publicized activists were Jack Baker and Mike McConnell. That's from Look magazine, which gave millions of viewers an idea about gay marriage. This was actually the first federal lawsuit, which no one wants to talk about, but by Menonia Evans and Donna Burkett in Milwaukee. Again, gay activists. And Paul Barwick and John Singer in Seattle, Washington, were actually the founders of the Gay Liberation Front in Seattle, Washington, and they were also among the first marriage offenders. Now, the different groups and organizations that were either created after Stonewall or transformed after Stonewall had in 1972 a big national convention or little conference where they came up with a platform. This is not a definitive platform, but this is a set of thoughts that were accepted at that conference, and I give you some of them, 5, 7, and 8, which today still look pretty radical. Repealing all laws governing the age of sexual consent. Many of us don't agree with that. Number 8 is the radical approach to family law, and that is repeal legislative provisions that restrict the sex of people entering into marriage, that'd be same-sex marriage, but also the number of persons, polyamory, and an extension, and this is an ongoing project, of the legal benefits to all persons who cohabitate, regardless of sex or numbers. In other words, don't over-reward marriage, expand marriage as well. A very radical project that maybe still has resonance today. The AIDS crisis was another both radicalizing and legally expanding moment. And it directly generated the momentum in the 1980s for domestic partnership employment policies as well as ordinances. Matt Coles is kind of the parent of much of this. And his goal in proposing in San Francisco over and over again until it's finally enacted in 1990, domestic partnership he proposed as a new form of family recognition, responsive both to the radical critiques of marriage, a la Stonewall, but also to the needs of people with AIDS and increasing numbers of lesbians who were having children within their relationship. And as you see, it had a rocky time, though ultimately it was adopted in San Francisco, dozens of other cities, hundreds of companies in the 1990s and in the new millennium. It also was adopted as a statute in California, and these are the four legislators: Jackie Goldberg, Carol Migden, Sheila Kuehl, who was Zelda and Dobie Gillis, and Christine Kehoe were the lesbian legislators who advanced that. Now, the process by which, and I'll give a short version of this, because I'm writing a whole book on this, the process by which this radicalism of the 70s and even the 80s is then transformed into ultimately what's successful as the marriage equality movement is the following. Whose motto, by the way, ended up being pretty much just like straight. In the 1990s, there was a new wave of marriage lawsuits, much less radically inclined than the one in the 70s. No gay liberation front behind these lawsuits. The first lawsuits in DC, Hawaii, and Vermont triggered ferocious backlash, notably the Defense of Marriage Act. Thank you, President Clinton. The Massachusetts lawsuit in Goodrich successfully fights backlash in large part by normalizing gay marriage and making it palatable to straight legislators and straight voters. There was a second wave of backlash after Goodrich. Goodrich is decided in 2003. The second wave, 2004 through 08, is focused on a series of ballot initiatives and the re-election of President Bush, which constitute tremendous defeats for the movement and a stalling of marriage equality. And then it also triggered an unprecedented amount of money invested into messaging. And the empirical research on messaging, which was not entirely news to the movement, was that voters, if you want to win ballot initiatives, basically don't like gay people. They do like straight people, they love married straight people, and they really love old married straight people who look like your grandparents. And that was the punchline. So if you actually want to win ballot initiatives, you go just like straight. And so you don't have even gay people pretending to be like straight. You have commercial after commercial in 2012 where gay people are unseen and not heard, and straight people, usually older grandparent-looking straight people, like Harlan Gardner in Maine, and John Kriesel in Minnesota, a veteran, both of them, testifying for their LGBT colleagues, who at the most are depicted smiling and grateful for the effort from straight people. And we actually won in 2012. For the first time, we won all the ballot initiatives in that November. With the big political victories in 2009 through 2012, the gayocracy then is emboldened to attack DOMA with a widow who lived right around the corner from Stonewall and who was actually stirred to activism after the riots. Of course, that was Edie Windsor, who was literally in Venice and returning from Venice with her wife, Thea Spire, on the night of the riots. She finds out about them when she goes to 7th Avenue to buy some cigarettes, she notices the streets are eerily quiet, this is the aftermath, and learns about the riots. And she and Thea become involved in gay activism in the Gay Community Center. And ultimately, as you see, after Thea's death, Edie Windsor becomes a plaintiff in the case that successfully challenges DOMA. 2 years later, in 2015, in a rainbow coalition of families that can be presented as families with children, and in many ways like straight families, the LGBT movement wins Obergefell. In an opinion by Justice Kennedy that is a paean to traditional marriage, just expanding it a wee bit to include lesbians with children. So that's a morally complicated trajectory from the ambiguous. Stonewall is like the Big Bang. But like the Big Bang, it produces a variety of results, some of them self-contradictory.
Excellent, thank you. And maybe not only self-contradictory, but maybe some good and some bad, depending on your point of view, right? So I knew this was going to happen. I knew it would take longer than anticipated, but I think entirely worthwhile. But so let's get into some more dialogue with the people who are here, as opposed to just amongst ourselves. We can all tell stories to one another and talk about who we knew and what's gone on. But I want to reach out to the audience and hear them. To the extent they don't have questions, I got questions. And I might take a spot down there because I don't want to be part of the conversation necessarily. I want to hear from y'all. But the thing that strikes me to start is really, what was the objective of the Gay Liberation Front? Because it obviously morphed and evolved, I would think, from the beginning to its more mature self. And I think we have to understand what generally objectives were at the time and how they've evolved to sort of determine, what's been successful, what hasn't been successful, and what more there is to do. But Martha, start us off by talking about the objectives.
Okay. The Gay Liberation Front by itself didn't have objectives that were. We started off pretty much with very similar objectives. Okay, I'll tell you a little short story. There was a conference called the Eastern Regional Conference of Homophile Organizations, met every year. I think it was in Philadelphia. And the first year after Gay Liberation Front, when it happened, I went down as one of the delegates from GLF. There were two women from Daughters of Bolinas. There were Mattachine people and so on. And there was a few little gay organizations that consisted of some man or woman, their lover, and a mimeograph machine. The Gay Liberation Front presented our platform. The right to sex with person or persons, consenting adults, the right to ingest drugs of one's choice, control over one's own body. Remember the time that this was all happening. Anti-war, and control of one's own body meant the right not to be drafted and forced to kill or be killed somewhere in another country. Women's reproductive rights, support for anti-racism, etc. Okay, one guy stood up. He was a gay activist of his time, but he was a very religious Catholic, and he was in favor of gay rights, but not of women's reproductive rights. And he made a little speech. The two women from DOB, one of whom had been raped and had an abortion, jumped up when he spoke against abortion and were furious and said what they had to say. As a result of the rebellion of the women, the whole Eastern Regional Conference adopted the Gay Liberation Front platform. That platform was essentially there from the beginning. It did not change. Splinter groups that later formed the Gay Activists Alliance, which focused again just on the gay issues, went off in different directions. But GLF essentially kept its platform from beginning to end.
I would just add to that. I always felt that our objective was to produce the idea that we, as gay and lesbian people, were part of the natural order of life. That we were an essential part of nature, and everything came from that.
Okay, so with that thought, what is the scorecard to that?
I think the scorecard is that things are moving in that direction. It was certainly an extremely radical idea back when we were at GLF, and I think that people, a significant part of many populations are starting to have that feeling. When I say many populations, not necessarily all in the U.S., but all in other parts of the world are starting to have that idea too. I think that a lot of young people especially, they have very much internalized that idea.
This lady had her hand up.
Yep, that's why I'm over here.
Thank you. Good morning to each of you. I think that as we mark the anniversary of Stonewall, that especially the first-hand eyewitness testimony that Perry and Martha share is so critically important to understand GLF as this multidimensional, intersectional, really community-encompassing, I'm going to use the term movement, but to me that minimalizes because I get that it was so much more. I want to connect that observation to what you referenced, Phil, in terms of not seeing ourselves at the edges as allies of other efforts, right? So I wonder if each of you in some way could talk to that a little bit more specifically in terms of how that GLF framework, if you will, looks today with the examples that you laid out for them.
Well, I can tell you, in regards to the AIDS movement, where we have been most successful, when we stand our ground as a part of the communities we belong to, and that, that for example, when I have conversations in black churches, I have conversations in black churches, but those are my churches. You don't get to invite or disinvite me from my home. And that means an obligation to be there when there is an issue that is unique to me, but also to be there when there are issues that that I may or may not perceive as central to what's going on in my life. So being a part of those things. But I think the key is to take open ownership of all of those communities that we belong to, whether they're our churches, our synagogues, or our mosques, or our neighborhood alliances, or all of those places. I think that's where that work is as an openly LGBTQI person. Now, as I think Martha talked about, is that there are many people, before someone who were active in those movements, but they were hiding, that they were involved in the movement. Barbara Smith said in the early days of the women's and the Black liberation movement that all the women are white and all the blacks are men, but some of us are brave. Our job is to be brave.
Very good.
I would be a little bit more mixed to report. Contemporaneously, in Washington, D.C., right after Stonewall, the Gay Activists Alliance was probably the big one. Frank Kameny was a leader in that, and others. And honestly, my understanding, I knew a lot of the people. I was not in Washington at that time. I know a lot of the people. That it was not like the Gay Liberation Front that you're describing in Washington, D.C. It was more politically organized.
But they were in GAA.
Huh?
You said they were.
They were GAA, that's right.
Because that was a very different organization.
That's right, but that was Washington, D.C.
Yeah, very good.
Now, here's the big take-home point for today. And that is, when you look at the long history of our movement, it has become much more bureaucratized. and bureaucratized,
And professionalized.
well, and
And
corporatized.
corporate.
Because you do not win these big political victories at the state level or the national level without a lot of organization, and organization means bureaucracy. And I'll tell you one other thing, so that you can just fill in the blanks on that, agree or disagree. The other thing I can share with you, which you may not know about, is that HRC, one of the more bureaucratic organizations in 2005, actually did an analysis talking within the community. Are we truly representative of the diversity of our community? And of course the answer was no. They didn't draw the conclusion it's because of the bureaucratized, corporatized groups. They didn't draw that conclusion. But they did draw a very insightful conclusion. And that is the way the LGBTQ groups have tended to operate is that we ally ourselves and form coalitions with other groups, civil rights groups, women's groups, et cetera, and we form coalitions with them as well. But the decision-making structure of many, and I think most, of the national groups and many, though not, maybe not most, of the state groups, is not integrated. And unless you have truly integrated organizational structures, and I mean integrated not just in terms of gender identity and race, but in terms of class, in terms of sex, etc., the goals of the movement are not going to reflect the complexity of the people in the movement.
Yeah.
That's a huge structural problem.
I'm a little concerned about the challenges. So, I came out in the early 80s, and as a Latina person, I never felt included in the gay movement because I was Latina, young lord's background, but also part of the women's movement. And so I think we're still at that place where it's a challenge. When we talk about gay or LGBT, we're still talking from a very homogeneous perspective, and that's a concern. The other concern I have is I have two kids that are Generation Z, LGBTQIA, and there is a generational divide between the baby boomers, Stonewall, millennials, and what I'd like to see is a discussion of how we can respect each other and move forward and be the best people we can be, and that's where I'm at the crossroads. So any thoughts would be helpful.
Mark?
Oh, yeah, thank you.
I just want to say that when the Young Lords started in Spanish Harlem, one of the things that I went up there and I met with them, and there was no problem whatsoever in terms of their accepting the gay movement. We had more trouble with the Panthers,
Yes.
but we did not have a problem with the Young Lords. I do not know what can be done to overcome some of that generational divide. What I also remember is that within the Gay Liberation Front and within the other organizations, there was a tremendous amount of disagreement, discussion, people going in different directions. And I don't expect that to be different. People are human in that way. But there were times when we all came together over particular crises that happened in our community. And there were Latinas and Latino guys in Gay Liberation Front as well.
Oh, yeah. I think that that generational divide is endemic in American society today. That ageism is endemic in American society today. And I really feel that I can't say this for the entire gay movement, but I can sort of say this for I'm still involved with a lot of queer organizing and activities and things like that. And we want, when I say we, I mean, because I'm an older person, obviously, we want to speak to younger people. And what we want to do with younger people and this is really happening certainly in New York, is we want to make younger people feel cared for, because often they don't feel cared for. And younger people in American society are extremely vulnerable now in ways that they weren't when I was a kid. And I thought things were pretty shitty when I was a kid, and they're worse now than many of them because of cyberbullying and situations like that. So we want to make these people feel, younger people feel cared for.
Well, I pick up on that just to add.
You can, just briefly, if you will. Yep.
If you want to do that, and this is a big challenge, we need to use the state to support and no longer to persecute.
Yes.
Like in schools, you've got to have local state support. The other thing about young people, I'm talking about the students that I teach, I do think, for my generation, a lot of emphasis on equality, equal protection. A lot of young people, the bigger emphasis is on self-determination. Non-binary individuals, they've expanded the agenda, but also I think they're changing the conversation in terms of what should be the focus normally. And I just throw that up for attention.
I mean, 12-year-olds are now coming out. Lots of 12-year-olds are coming out. So you have situations in schools with the gay-straight alliances, but weirdly enough, that's also added a real class structure to this situation, because often the schools that have the most amount of attention to LGBT kids are now private schools.
So I think that I speak to the generational divide, that I think is important. But I also think it's important that it's not one directional, yes, we want to talk to young people, but we don't necessarily want to listen to young people.
Right.
And so this whole issue around the generation is bi-directional. And we want to take care of them, but we don't want to respect the fact that they in fact may have the tools to take care of themselves if we get out of the way. And I think about my own activism, and I think both Perry and Martha talked about it as well. When I started my first organization, I was 25 years old, and I didn't know anything, and yet I did it. And yet, we seem to think that when a 25-year-old or 26-year-old or 16-year-old decides that they actually have the tools to do whatever it is that they want to do, that they don't have the capacity to do that. And so it's a bi-directional thing.
So and that of course is going on for generations, right? So yes, go ahead.
Hi, thank you all for a terrific panel. I have a question for Martha. My name is Nancy Polikoff. I'm fairly well known for my skepticism about marriage equality as a goal. And I'm wondering what you would say now about the impact of marriage equality on the movement.
I think it's kind of been a double-edged sword. On the one hand, those of us who are married, including me, feel, that's a big relief in terms of our lives. It makes it a lot easier. On the other hand, I think in some ways it has also stalled some of the other things that we were fighting for. Because, you've got marriage equality. You can now go and get yourself shot in Afghanistan as an open gay. What do you want more? And people have sometimes lost sight of the longer struggle. To get back to the previous question for just a second, I think one of the things we older people can do to support the younger people is do something about the cost of tuition and the loans that kids have to take to go to college. Make life easier for them economically if we can, and support that. And then get out of the way when they want to do things with their education, with their training, with their skills and knowledge.
Great, thank you.
Hi, thank you all for a great panel. Some things that have popped into my head, it was great to hear your perspective on the movement and the GLF and Mattachine and whatnot. But I'm concerned that we went from a great place of inclusivity of gay is good to now sort of only good people get to be gay. I feel like we've kind of created a sort of a regime where if it's now good if you're married, if you're employed, if you're cisgendered, if you have children, you have a strong network of friends and you're not lonesome, if you're sexually liberated but you're safe because you're on a medication, and if you're engaged. But I'm concerned that, early on this struggle between the GLF and the Mattachines and whatnot seemed to be about a difference of approach. But I feel like now we've carved up interests, and where are, to Phil's point, when you say we should be involved in these things because they are important to us, but I'm worried and I'd love some information about who is us, and when we talk about being inclusive as a community, who is included? Are we still including unmarried people, people who are not on PrEP, people who are underemployed, people who are slutty, people who are not politically activated, people who are homeless? Where is that, and how do we as a community deal with issues of internalized homophobia so we have a sense of us again?
Love it.
I totally support what you're saying, and that has been very controversial. As soon as marriage equality started to really surface and become this popular motion, so many of my friends who were single said, well, what about me? Who is going to take care of me? And I think that this has to be a national priority. And no one's making it a national priority. It needs to be a national priority. And part of that also goes along with, we've got to have a national healthcare system so that people who are not plugged into a family system or some other system, that they have to actually have some recourse.
Other thoughts? Anyone?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think that goes with the whole economic issue that I mentioned,
Yes.
the vast economic inequality of our country. And in my lifetime, I have seen a huge decline in the purchasing power of the American worker. From the time when there were 3 kids in my family, my father was able, on his take-home pay of $70 a week, to support a wife and 3 kids, and to send us to the country for the summer in a little bungalow. Nobody with that kind of, even, adjusting for inflation, no single worker can do that these days. And
I'm sorry, just to follow up, maybe I didn't make my point clearly. I think we have a problem in our community that we are no longer invested in one another because we've carved up our interests. And if you are not one of these people who are a good gay, I don't know that we have resources happening within our community because are we interested enough in each other for there to be an us? And so I just want to be a little more specific with that because I appreciate that, but what are we doing? What are we doing for each other? And what could we be? And really, not what have we done, or what could we do? What can we do? And what would we do to help each other?
Bill?
I think there's a structural problem that you're raising, and that is nothing brings people together, heterogeneous people together, better than common persecution.
Right.
When we were all outlaws, the rich gays had something much more in common with the poor gays, et cetera, et cetera. That doesn't mean it always worked out that way, okay? And so part of the problem is that we have made these advances. And number 2, the axes of heterogeneity have increased. So yes, we've always had the class divides. We've always had the race divides, sex and gender. But now we also have these other more complicated divides. And I just throw out for people to think about, what's the effect of the internet on this? On the one hand, you would think that the internet could bring us together because we could have conversations. But the internet also drives us apart by forming echo chambers and forming these very different things going on. So I think there are just real difficulties. And so if you ought to get a Nobel Prize if you can think of a really one smart way, maybe internet-ish, or maybe your children, the Gen Z people, they're going to be the ones who are going to be able to come up with internet-based solutions.
Well, I would say 2 things. One, I think that what you're talking about is kind of what I talked about in the beginning of my talk about the price of the ticket. And so we decided along the way that the price of the ticket was to be just like them. You know, if we're using these them and us kind of narratives. And so what happens is that once I'm just like them, once I've identified the one thing that excludes me from the rights of privilege, then I don't have to worry about anything else. That's the price of the ticket. In many ways, that's been our strategy.
And the
I think
ticket
that's
keeps getting more expensive.
That's right. And then the other part of that, I think, on the internet part, I think, is that this also speaks to the generational issue, is that people are hostile when they don't have to know you. You know, people say things behind the anonymity of a computer that they would never say to your face. You know, and it breaks up that sense of community that we have. I think on the good side of that I think there are examples of kind of that we all have skin in the game. For example, I think that the progress we're making on trans issues, where folks who you wouldn't think would be invested in trans issues actually are invested in trans issues and take them personally. You know, generationally, you know, many of us, and I have to admit, I was one of them, that in the early days of my speeches, I would say, you know, I would do the alphabet in the first part of the speech and say, from now on, you know, gay and lesbian is code for the whole alphabet. You know, and now I would never think to do that. You know, and so I think that there are efforts that are being made in spots and in examples, but overall, I think that you are right about the predicament we're in.
So I want to, all right.
A one-sentence dissent. It's the lawyers' fault.
Hold it.
There was no community deliberation on marriage equality. The lawyers led that. That was not a community decision.
All right.
Some lawyers led that, okay? Not all lawyers.
And I'm one of them.
Right.
But that was not a community
Okay, so
decision.
Martha, you had it.
Yeah, where do you live?
I'm in New Mexico.
Okay, and I'm in Portland, Oregon, and I don't see that breakup so much in our community. In the little community that I'm in within Portland, we all look out for each other, and without the distinction in terms of whether you're homeless or gay or straight or whatever, my best friends next door are fundamentalist Christians, and they are with us.
Okay, no, I'm sorry.
Can Robert talk?
Yes, okay, Robert can talk. Where's Robert?
Yeah, I don't think I need a microphone. In the deep dark 80s, I was at a Jesuit law school here in New York City and discovered an article that talked about, and it was really enlightening to me, about what Phil talked about earlier, and using the new word intersectionality. The article talked about, it was a law review article, about how gender is performance. And this, and also in the lines of talking about generational differences, I have had a fight, and had fights with members of the Stonewall generation about including trans people in our fight, in our battles. Say, well, they're riding on our coattails, or whatever. No, they're not. We rode on the civil rights movement's coattails, by the way. But secondly, remember who hates us. Those who hate the way we perform our gender. Or, as Polly Murray wrote about, perform our race. We are not doing what society expects of us. And that does unite us, because the same people who hate trans people hate gay people. We all have that in common. I mean, and that to me is something that does unite us, and why we do have to be part of all these struggles, including reproductive choice, including all these other things, because it's the same people who are against it. It is all the same people, and we all have that in common, rich, poor, whatever. So that to me is just a different way of saying that we have to do this together.
Thank you, Robert. All right, so I'm going to end with this question. You have 30 seconds, each of you. And as you can tell, I will hold you to it. So yesterday morning we had a program with Supreme Court and constitutional scholars. It's a really great program, but incredibly depressing as we look at the prospect of what we can expect from our federal courts going forward as it affects this issue and the movement and the things that we have accomplished. So my question is, if that's the future, the federal courts, for some period of time, as Phil says, maybe generations. Does that provide another opportunity to return to a form of street activism or political movement that we perhaps have abandoned over the last 2 decades as we pursued a legal strategy? Thoughts?
Yes, you bet your sweet ass. It's going to bring, I cannot believe it will not bring all of our communities together, because we're seeing the threat up ahead. I mean, and the rise of Donald Trump has brought people together I never thought would be brought together. I'll tell you that.
Yeah. Bill?
I agree, there's nothing like a common enemy. The lawyers, however, are going to also want to say the federal courts have never been the primary mechanism for our legal redress. It's always been state courts. The third thing I will say is that I really do think it's street activism. Let's think about net activism.
Yes.
Right.
Let's think about net activism that creates street activism, where you have street activism that's coordinated by the internet and by cell phones. And again, I think we need to look to Generation Z to figure out methods of mobilization and deliberation. And I will repeat, the community did not decide on marriage equality. It was not entirely, but it was dominated by lawyers.
Rest upon us.
And it was dominated by the structural feature that if you brought, that anybody could bring a marriage lawsuit, and that immediately put it on the agenda for us as well as the nation. And increasingly, it cannibalized the other things that were on the family law agenda to some extent. And that's just a phenomenon.
I think we have something else to unfortunately look forward to. It's not just the federal courts that are being taken over by these extreme right people. We're looking at a growing fascist movement in the United States and the possibility of civil war. It's not just that it's going to be street activism, there's going to be blood in the streets. That's the way I see it.
Bill?
Oh, that's right. I think that
That seems depressing too.
I actually think it's an opportunity to do what, in many ways, we do best, and that's the ability to win, to use a bureaucratic phrase, to win the hearts and minds. I think there are two things that dramatically moved us forward. The first one was the Come Out movement. When we started that movement about coming out, National Coming Out Day, and showing up and being present and what have you, so that everyone knew one of us. And the second was the HIV/AIDS movement. And all of that was about, kind of winning the hearts and minds and showing up and having conversations. And I think that strategically increasing that work is going to be important. I think there'll be an opportunity to do that.
So I appreciate all of you, and with one thought. So I think my kids think that this has been easy. I think that because my kids are 18 and 21, and they've watched, and we've had seemingly victory after victory, and I've worried that we haven't had people like you out there who are sharing with them what needs to be done. I saw the movie On the Basis of Sex. Have you seen this? And there's this great scene where Ruth Bader Ginsburg is going to meet with Dorothy Kenyon, who is the great lawyer in the feminist movement, and she says, we took to the streets to demand change. Our mistake was thinking that we had won. We started asking, please, as if civil rights were sweets to be handed out by a judge. I think that we do ourselves a great disservice if somehow we think we've won. And that we have got to, there's a place for asking please, but there's perhaps a more important place for just demanding what's right. Anyway, thank you all for being here.